History is often written in slow drips, but what if it cracked all at once? The 5th of March 1953. Joseph Stalin, the Iron Man of Russia, lies dying in his dacha outside Moscow. The world holds its breath, east in fear, west in relief. In our reality, the Soviet machine groaned but did not shatter. Stalin died, and Nikita Khrushchev cautiously guided the USSR into the messy decades of the Cold War. But imagine a sudden fracture. No Khrushchev, no Brezhnev, no Soviet colossus lumbering forward. Instead, chaos. An empire built on fear collapses the moment its architect exits. The Red Empire falls apart in 1953. That's our starting line. The question is chilling. Who would rule the world in a universe where Stalin's death destroyed the Soviet Union overnight? The stage before the collapse, 1953. Before we let imagination run, let's survey the battlefield. The year is 1953. World War II ended only 8 years earlier. Cities across Europe still look like open wounds, rubble and smoke lingering as memorials. Here are the big players. The United States, richer than ever, with more cars, refrigerators, and skyscrapers than the rest of the world combined. Its atomic monopoly, just 4 years gone, it is still the undisputed giant of power and wealth. The Soviet Union, exhausted but massive, a police state holding Eastern Europe in a chokehold. Stalin's paranoia had killed rivals and terrified allies alike. China, Mao Zedong, had just triumphed 4 years earlier. A proud new revolutionary state, but still poor, rural, and dependent on Soviet support. Western Europe, Britain weary, France battered, Germany divided, Italy shaky. Yet under U.S. aid through the Marshall Plan, factories were humming again. The rest of the world, colonies in Africa and Asia, were shaking off Europe's grip. India, independent. Indonesia, newly sovereign. Algeria, Kenya, Vietnam, and dozens more ready to fight for freedom. The globe was fragile, unstable, and primed for a contest of empires. Stalin's USSR was one half of the Cold War scaffolding. Pull that half away suddenly, and the whole structure would rattle. Scenario 1. The Soviet Union shatters in 1953. Let's boldly assume what was barely possible. Stalin dies, and the empire instantly fragments. Instead of an orderly succession, the Politburo is paralyzed. His deputies Khrushchev, Beria, Malenkov, Molotov distrust each other so deeply that cooperation collapses. Power outages follow inside the USSR. Workers in Moscow go to factories one morning and find no clear government orders. Villages in Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics, already resentful under Moscow's grip, seize their chance to rebel. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe wakes up to a miracle. No Soviet tanks enforcing order. Poles gather in Warsaw squares. Hungarians march in Budapest. Czechs cheer in Prague. Without the Red Army's shadow, the puppet regimes crumble like paper. Suddenly, the USSR isn't a superpower. It is a civil war zone of rival leaders, nationalist movements, and regions demanding independence. The nuclear arsenal lies scattered under uncertain control. The once feared red giant collapses like a sandcastle against the tide. So who steps forward to paint the next century? Option 1. The United States becomes unstoppable. The obvious candidate, America. If the Soviet Union had fractured overnight, the United States would shine brighter than ever. With Europe already tied economically to Washington through the Marshall Plan, America could extend its influence into Eastern Europe as well. Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, instead of decades behind the Iron Curtain, they might join NATO in the 1,950 seconds rather than the 1,990 seconds. The U.S. would also seize the cultural moment. Hollywood films already filled theaters from Paris to Calcutta. Rock and roll was poised to travel on vinyl. Coca-Cola and blue jeans weren't just products, they were statements of identity. With Moscow removed as an ideological rival, American consumer optimism could travel unchecked across the globe. And militarily, NATO would stand as the only game in town. No Warsaw Pact, no missile gap paranoia, just American air bases, fleets, and bombers stationed wherever allies requested them. This would be Pax Americana, too, an American century not just in name but in complete monopoly. But unchallenged power often creates as many enemies as friends. Without Moscow on the chessboard, resistance might come from unexpected places. Option 2. China steps out of the shadow. Mao Zedong, in 1953, was Stalin's younger comrade, defiant yet overshadowed. China was vast, hungry, and restless. If the USSR imploded, Mao would find himself in a unique position, the sole surviving communist giant. Instead of constantly depending on Soviet aid and advice, Beijing could position itself as the new Romeo of communism, with Mao as its Caesar. Guerrilla fighters in Africa? They would look to Beijing, not Moscow. Revolutions in Latin America, Che, Castro, and others might see China as the mentor. In Asia, Vietnam would model more closely on Beijing's strategies than on Soviet blueprints. This would make China the ideological leader of the post-colonial world. Third world nations, those neither aligned with the US nor trusting colonial Europe, could rally to Mao's banner. Thus, the Cold War might still happen, but it would be Washington versus Beijing, launched 2 decades earlier than in reality. Option 3. Europe rebuilds into a giant. Don't underestimate old powers. Europe in 1953 looked weak, cities still recovering, armies shrinking, economies bruised. But without the Soviet threat looming, European nations might rediscover confidence. Germany could reunify earlier, injecting raw industrial and technological muscle into Europe. France and Britain, still clinging to their colonies in Africa and Asia, could turn their empires into leverage points. The European coal and steel community, the seed of today's European Union, might expand faster, with Eastern Europe joining far sooner. Imagine a West Berlin not divided, but leading a powerful, unified Europe by the 1970 seconds. A United States of Europe standing shoulder to shoulder with, or even competing against, the United States. In this alternate reality, Europe might not just be a junior partner to Washington, it could become a genuine third superpower. The nuclear wildcard. All these power shifts assume one terrifying detail is handled safely: nuclear weapons. In reality, the USSR tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. By 1953, it possessed a small but deadly arsenal. If Stalin's death dissolved centralized control, those bombs would be floating in chaos. Possibilities spiraled darkly. Soviet generals acting independently, launching weapons in desperation or by accident. U.S. forces conducting covert operations to secure stockpiles, risking confrontations with rogue Soviet officers. Breakaway regions, say, Ukraine or Kazakhstan, inheriting nuclear stockpiles decades before they did in our timeline. Worst case, nuclear material slipping to independent actors decades before terms like terrorist nuke entered headlines. In short, the Soviet collapse of 1991 filtered through the nightmare of 1953's less stable, more volatile world. The Cold War might have been replaced by the nuclear Wild West. The domino effect on the Cold War. Let's trace some dominoes. Without a Soviet bloc to anchor East Germany, there is no Berlin Wall. Germany could reunify in the 1950 seconds. A reunited Germany means accelerated industrial dominance at the heart of Europe. Korea. The Korean War ended in 1953. Without Soviet aid, North Korea collapses. A united Korea emerges under U.S. alignment, reshaping East Asian economics and politics. The space race. Without the Soviet Union to launch Sputnik in 1957, the U.S. might slow its space ambitions. Perhaps no moon landing by 1969. Humanity might step onto the moon, not in the 20th century, but the 21st. The UN, a world organization paralyzed by constant US-Soviet clashes in our reality, might become stronger and more influential in this alternate universe. With Moscow absent from the Security Council's veto power, the planet spins an entirely different story. If you remove that one Soviet pillar, who ends up ruling the world? So, after weighing these scenarios, where does global power land? Most likely outcome? Short-term 1,953, 1,970. The United States dominates nearly absolutely, stretching its political, economic, and military shadow across Europe and Asia. Midterm 1,972,000. A rapid rise of China's an ideological rival, drawing support from post-colonial nations. Potential wildcards. A strong set united Europe or volatile nuclear chaos could shift balances unpredictably. In this alternate timeline, there is no steady two-superpower Cold War. Instead, there's an initial American hegemony, followed by a Washington-Beijing rivalry emerging much earlier than in our own history. Beyond borders, the human ripple. We've covered geopolitics. Let's talk about people. Technology and science. Without the space race as competition, advancements may slow. Satellites, computers, and rockets could arrive later, delaying the communication revolution. Perhaps we'd still be mailing postcards when we should have been emailing. Culture. American music, cinema, and consumerism would face no counterweight from the Soviet other. The Cold War paranoia that gave us spy thrillers, dystopian films, and existential novels might vanish. Instead, mid-century art might carry more optimism, less Orwell, more Walt Disney. Colonial liberation. Anti-colonial movements, many of which relied on Soviet funding and support, would struggle. However, China might fill this role, inspiring movements from Vietnam to Angola far earlier. Still, the paths to independence might be bloodier and more chaotic. The final what if. Here's the verdict. If Stalin's death had triggered the instant collapse of the Soviet Union, the world would have tilted into a US-dominated age, cultural, economic, and military hegemony, thicker than ever. But history doesn't like monopolies. So in time, a China-led counterweight would rise much earlier than in our reality. The Cold War still happens, not as Washington versus Moscow, but as Washington versus Beijing, a clash of capitalism and Maoism shaping the latter half of the 20th century. Would that world be better? Perhaps no Berlin Wall, no Cuban Missile Crisis, no half-century of nuclear terror, but also maybe no moon landing, no global balance of fear, no cautious restraint that paradoxically kept hot wars limited. History, as always, trades one set of monsters for another. And so the ultimate answer is this. In the vacuum of Stalin's shattered empire, the US would rule the world until a new dragon rose to demand the throne.